And we begin our program today in New York, where the United Nations General Assembly is underway. It is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations and the only one where all member states have equal representation. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China is determined to work with the UN member states to safeguard world peace and stability and promote development and prosperity.
Building a central role in global governance. The opening of the 72nd session of the United Nations General Assembly was declared by its new president, Miroslav Lajcak, on Tuesday. Lajcak highlighted the importance of sustainable development goals and UN reform. He also spoke highly of China's effort in global governance.
I'm glad to see China playing a very important role, being a leader on a number of global issues, and I wish to see China continue playing this role and speak not only in its national capacity, but speak as a promoter of the UN agenda.
China stands ready to join the international community to actively promote the reform of the global governance system. Earlier on Monday, the 71st session of the UNGA adopted a resolution which incorporates the principles of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits advocated by China.
The resolution demonstrates that Chinese voices, proposals, and wisdom are gaining understanding, support, and response from an increasing number of countries and are becoming the consensus of the international community.
The principles that have been endorsed are also found in China's One Belt, One Road initiative. Pakistan's permanent representative to the UN said all countries could benefit from them.
I think China has a leading role to play in the evolution of global economic governance for the future, not only because China is a very important global economic power, but also because China brings to the table its experience.
Next week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi will attend the annual general debate of UNGA. Wang will elaborate on China's position and propositions on the international situation as well as major international and regional issues. As a founding member of the UN, China can contribute more to building a shared future for mankind.
For more discussion on the significance of this year's UN General Assembly and what is really behind it, in Beijing we have Mrs. Agi Veres, who is the country director of the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, here in China. Welcome to our program, ma'am. And also joining us in Beijing, Professor Fu Jun, our longtime friend, professor of National School of Development at Peking University. He's now doing a lot of research on South-South cooperation these days. And in Washington, D.C., in the U.S., we invited Cheng Li, the director and senior fellow at the Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution, a well-respected scholar on China and the world. I want to have a big welcome to the 3 of you. We have a very strong panel today, but I want to begin the discussion with you, Ms. Veres. The significance of the United Nations these days have been very much debated. How relevant is it still? While you see some of the member countries are already refusing to pay their share of the fees.
Well, I think multilateralism and the United Nations as the largest multilateral organization is still very relevant today. Why? Because multilateralism is really about a joint dialogue of various nations to find common solutions and common approaches to common problems.
But multilateralism does not necessarily have to be all about UN. It could be about some other international organizations as well, Mrs. Veres.
That's right. But the United Nations is the one organization that essentially has 193 member states. And when we're looking at the world, which is faced with many, many global problems, from climate change to disasters, terrorism, and other conflict-related issues, we really need global solutions to these problems. And to have global solutions, including all the countries, we need a global governance mechanism, which the UN represents.
Mr. Li, you are based in Washington, D.C. You are aware of the thing going on there, which is President Trump, from the U.S. side, rather, is saying, well, really, the UN that important anymore? Is it still relevant? What do you think?
Well, certainly I disagree, but probably it's not really entirely correct to characterize Donald Trump in that way, because he actually paid attention to UN resolution regarding North Korea nuclear proliferation, and also that he sent a very important figure in his team to be the UN ambassador. So that speaks loud about his position on UN. Of course, as the largest country and the largest economy in the world, the superpower, the only superpower in today's world, that sometimes the U.S. may have its different approach, because some of the member states, the U.S. Assembly could be only have like several 100,000 people. So they have some different perspective. That's understandable, but I think that UN certainly, U.S. certainly should pay more attention to collaborate with UN, to work with UN, and I think the key word is governance. And there's no single word is more important than governance. Governance in domestic situation, in terms of clean government, civil society, and the governance in the world affairs in terms of deal with common challenges and also peace and security.
Mr. Li, if I could just follow up a bit, Secretary General Guterres, he said very recently in the recent quote to the U.S. President, he said, you know, the ultimate American interest lies in a multilateral network like the United Nations. Do you think President Trump and his administration understand this?
Well, I think some of his team members certainly understand very well. I think Donald Trump also has a learning curve. Certainly before he became president, he said some things that the U.S. should have more on doing things by its own. And he is not paying so much attention to international organization, and also talk about the U.S. role in the NATO and many other multilateral communities. But certainly you can see the change over the past 6 or 7 months. He actually continued to remain in some of the international institutions and even pay more attention to UN on the issue of the Korean Peninsula.
Interesting. We're going to come to you later about governance issue. Let's turn to you, Professor Fu, here in China. Of course, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has been very upbeat about the role of the United Nations. Just think about how many days he spent at the UN meetings and conferences, and also meeting with the UN different officials and agencies as well. What is likely in China's mind in terms of UN's role, in China's overall blueprint for its own future?
Well, United Nations will continue to have a big role to play, especially when we fight against a long list of global challenges. Having said that, there are gaps and holes in the system. If we understand why the UN has worked, it's because the UN keep a balance between idealism and the realism. And now we have to make an adjustment to the system because reality has moved ahead of idealism. By that I mean, if you look at the economic dimension of the global system, you see very dramatic shifts globally. And we need to make appropriate adjustment to the system. But of course, when you open up the UN system, you see different dimensions, right? The political dimension of the UN system, and there, even when you have lofty principles, when you say countries big or small are equals, but the operationalization of that is reflect the reality that big major countries are permanent members of the Security Council, has veto powers. But imagine a system where every country has a veto power. Can that work? But then the economic dimension, you look at the IMF, World Bank, the voting are weighted according to the contribution. Then you have other agencies like UNESCO. Each country has one vote. So it's the combination of all these that make the system robust. I also need to add, there are gaps in the holes, and we should we have more to do to make that even more
I think there
robust.
are two different things, as you mentioned, Professor Fu. One is the ultimate structure of the United Nations and the idea of the United Nations, the ideal the United Nations has been holding since the founding days, whether that has been outdated. That is a very different nature compared to, let's just say, do some minor adjustment, let's just say bigger voices coming from the developing emerging economies, and also more UN Security Council reform. These are two very different issues. One is challenging the overall credibility of the UN system itself. The other is about how should we do to bear in mind. Having said that, though, the UN has been reforming and evolving over the decades since its founding. The UN General Assembly President recently said the UN reforms will now allow the world organization to work in a way it never has before. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also said he is totally committed to reforming the UN and making it more responsive to the needs of the 21st century, even though it sounds abstract. But, Ms. Veres, I'm sure you know when it's on the ground, it shouldn't be that abstract. And therefore, I want to ask you, United Nations Development Program is the head agency among all UN agencies when you are looking at one country. Usually it is the head of the UNDP that is helping to coordinate all the other agencies in one country. So I guess, in a way, you could better help us to understand that. What exactly is the role of your organization, let's just say, in China? How has that been different from previously? What exactly is the function of you now, Ms. Veres?
I think the key question is that the world has changed a lot. So since the setup of the UN and UNDP as a development organization, so we need to look at what is the world looking like today. So the role of UNDP as a development organization is very much advocating for development. And what this means is that we want an equal world where nobody is left behind. So the role of the UN and UNDP is not necessarily to do everything ourselves, but to be a facilitator, to be a convener that can leverage a lot of the resources and a lot of the capacities that are out there to address the development.
I heard an interesting word, facilitator. That's interesting because now you're suggesting you try to be a bridge rather than one going out there and do every project on your own. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because the shift in terms of the role of UNDP, for example, from an organization that has a lot of resources to offer to an organization that has the experience and the capacity to offer, and that
What kind of experiences? What kind of capacities? Are you using just the abstract word to impress us, or actually there are a lot of contents in it, Ms. Veres?
UNDP is present in 170 countries and territories, so that means we actually are very familiar with the context of these developing countries. We understand the development issues, and we compiled a lot of experience over the years how to address them. So through our network and the experience that we have, we can offer these solutions to other developers in innovation, and we can bring various partners together to address these together.
Belt and Road, is that one of those examples?
The Belt and Road is a good example in the sense that this is a more than one country's development issue, and while it's a vision for shared economic growth, this can be an accelerator to achieve global development.
And therefore, what is your role?
Our role in this, from a perspective of sitting in China for UNDP, is to try to bridge and try to link what China has to offer in terms of, for example, investments, connectivities, and what these developing countries need to address their development issues. So UNDP, as you said, the word facilitator and the word of bringing together the supply and demand, essentially trying to make sure that whatever investments and economic growth is there, it will generate development impact in these countries.
I've been to some of those conferences that you organize, UNDP in China organized, bringing all the other countries along the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly here in Asia, from Myanmar, from Vietnam, from everywhere, coming together and talk about some of the possible plans and also public and private partnership in a way. Those are very interesting ideas. That's why I want to go back to you, Mr. Li. When it comes to international governance, there is reform about the UN system itself. There's also the reform about what is the proportion of responsibilities and also share in saying in the international organizations such as the United Nations. Let's just say China, developing economies, the emerging economies, vis-a-vis some of the developed ones. Mr. Li.
Well, of course, you have a good point. If you just single out the United States and China, these two countries actually they possess 40% for global GDP, and some of the tiny countries is so small. But I think the design of the United Nations has one is the assembly, United Nations Assembly with all the member states. The other is the National Permanent Security Council, which has 5 major powers. So that explains the balanced approach. And on the one hand, you should pay attention to some major powers, but at the same time, the small countries' concerns should be heard. So that's a good design. Of course, the UN will continue to experience some reform in terms of budget, in terms of how to deal with possible corruption, and also that to make it more effective in some common goods, and whether it be environment protection, whether it be peacekeeping, especially in today's world, the refugee issue is so important. So I think in that regard that the UN will continue play a very, very important role. I think China and the United States are a major part of the UN, and we should not forget that the UN is located in the United States, and U.S. ambassador to UN usually later on move to be important position like a Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. That also tells U.S. actually, despite its own kind of major power sentiment or mentality, still think UN is important vehicle, and especially U.S. international relations scholars certainly value the importance of UN.
But Professor Fu, here's an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, the United States rather, as Mr. Li rightly pointed out, paid very much attention to the UN Security Council resolutions, particularly concerning DPRK. They want to get this consensus going on to show to North Korea. But at the same time, there has been a brush off of the significance of the other UN agencies. How do you see this apparent divide in a way in attitudes? Secondly, how is that compared to China? Is it going to be some competition between these two countries? Do you think the UN would love to see that? Ms. Berry already smiling at this point. Or you will see there's likely to be very different roles for China and the United States for the future in the framework of the United Nations. Professor
my observation of the United States is that the United States is both a republic and also an empire. Now, the difficult part of the global system is in the absence of a global government. Big powers have to come together to hold the system together. The United States has and will continue to play a very important role. Having said that, when we look at the role of China, China is a country that has moved from a country with economic performance measured by GDP per capita of a few $100 now to 8,000. Right. And when you think with the background, and China will merge as a country that will take more responsibilities to play. And the matter of fact is that it has already taken more responsibilities. If you're sort of thinking of the system as three dimensions, right. The physical dimension, institute dimension, and the dimension of ideas. China has been doing that in terms of the infrastructure, one belt, one road system, our contribution to the institute dimension in the example of Asia Investment Bank, and my organization, the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development. It's a platform for exchange of ideas.
What about bigger say? If you have bigger responsibilities, obviously you're expecting bigger say, I guess. Is that true for China too? Direct answer, please. Please do not be diplomatic, Professor Fu. Go ahead, direct answer.
If we are making positive contributions, we should have a big voice in the institution that we are part of.
All right. Having said that, though, how to have a bigger voice? What kind of bigger voice? Bigger voice for whom? That comes to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. I guess I still have a souvenir coming from the UN, the little China panda over here. That is supposed to be the Sustainable Development Goal panda. Ms. Veres, this, of course, is just a soft stuff, the toy. But this is also an effort coming from the UN to try to persuade every country that they have a role in the Sustainable Development Goal. 2030, that's the year we are talking about. How far are we coming from drawing up the real blueprint? We can talk all the time, but where is the plan, Ms. Veres?
Well, it's a bit early to tell how far we came.
Still early?
We're 2 years into the plan, and the reason I'm saying it's early because the main step is that 193 countries are actually agreed on something, which is not that common. So that is a great achievement. So in that sense, I think we already took a big step forward. But in terms of monitoring and measuring the results, it's a very complex picture because while this agreement is there, it has 17 goals with hundreds of indicators behind it. So to see the progress from a baseline to something we want to achieve will take some time.
You guys have already drawn up a very complicated system in order to make it work. But Mr. Li, is there going to be competition about countries within the UN framework when it comes to whether to achieve Sustainable Development Goals? We understand governments have views on some of the questions, climate change and the security situation for the future, poverty issue as well. Mr. Li.
Well, absolutely, because different countries have different agenda, different priorities, despite the fact that there's also shared interest and shared emphasis. So we should not forget that at the time when the U.S. soft power is declining, you can imagine that China become more and more important. But at the same time, we should also make sure that China's growing influence will take some time, because China's commitment for foreign aid, for refugees, for peacekeeping, although increased significantly over the past few years, but compared with some other countries, is still quite limited. And of course, China is very popular among Latin America, in African countries, but a lot of other countries, including China's neighboring country and maybe Western country, for a right reason or wrong reason, has still a lot of concern. So what we call the Chinese 话语权, the voice, should be heard, but this should be based on China's positive contribution. I think in that regard, we see the development. We welcome China's growing influence, but at the same time, China probably needs to take more responsibility. And at the same time, you see a lot of movements. Some countries want to join, become the permanent UN Security Council, and some countries really emphasize on the UN reform. So these are naturally, there's some different interests and conflict views.
When you think about almost 200 countries together, having some consensus, that is mind-boggling to me. But before we go, final words from you, Professor Fu, as well.
Well, I buy the concept of a common and a shared responsibility. That is a reflection of different stages of development of each country. In the case of China, our GDP as an aggregate amount is number 2, but in terms of GDP per capita, it's a little bit over 8,000. We still have a long way to go.
A long way to go, but for now, the panda should be working for the Sustainable Development Goal. I'll let you bring it back home. Thank you so much for being with us. Agi Veres, Fu Jun, and Cheng Li. Really appreciated all of you for being with us. Thank you.